Alright, hey guys, welcome back. It is Gene, and I thought I'd bring you along for a flight here I took a few years ago in an NG. And this was after a day trip throughout the Midwest. Developed a little bit of a maintenance issue when I was out on the road. MEL'd it and was able to drop the passengers off back at base. And in this particular flight, I'm just repositioning the airplane empty over to a different airport for maintenance. So it's just me and the airplane here, and it was a very windy, bumpy day in the Midwest, which is a frequent occurrence there, and had a very interesting landing to say the least. So the wind this day was 280, gusting all the way up to 34 knots, and I'm landing on a north-south runway. So it was a perpendicular crosswind gusting to 34 knots, and to make matters even a little bit more complicated, the airport only has one runway and it was closed for resurfacing, so they were using a parallel taxiway as a temporary runway. And that taxiway was only 2,900 feet by 40 feet wide. So the 2,900 feet isn't so big of a deal on the Pilatus. That's not particularly short, although it's certainly not amply long. But only 40 feet wide is pretty darn narrow. So, I mean, it's a taxiway. So in anything but a very small airplane, you got to be right on the center line. And when you have a crosswind as strong as I did this day, that definitely makes for a little bit of an interesting landing. So I'm just putting the gear down there, turning on the taxi landing lights and everything, and then I'm on a right base to the runway. I'm just getting situated for this landing because I know it's going to be a little bit of an interesting one. And I have a really strong rip-roaring tailwind out of the west here, so I'm going to start the turn nice and early onto final. Remember that when you have a strong tailwind like this on base, that your ground speed is high, so you want to start the turn early and bank a little more steeply than you normally would. That way you don't overshoot final, overbank, raise your stall speed, end up cross-controlled, and have a low altitude stall spin accident. Many people have died that way. So I'm just going to start the turn nice and early. And I also actually had a bird strike on the rollout here as well, which I'll show you. Luckily it didn't do any damage. So I'm just starting a really early turn onto final. You'll see the runway, and you'll notice as I come around the turn here that I'm actually intentionally flying through final, because remember, I'm not lining up on the runway, I'm lining up on the taxiway. So you can see the main runway, and I'm flying through final intentionally there to line up on the taxiway that's just east of the runway, parallel to the runway. And that's my actual runway that I'm landing on, temporary runway. So it's runway 17, and again, it's a perpendicular crosswind. So I'm just going to land flaps 15 anytime there's a lot of crosswind or wind shear. We want to land with reduced flaps. I have a video on that I'll link to here, but I've got the gear down, flaps 15, trimmed up, stabilized on speed. I'm carrying a little bit of extra speed due to the reduced flaps and all the wind shear. You can see me bumping around down final there. And the key is just to not do too much. You know, let the airplane do all the heavy lifting. Don't induce PIO by, making matters more complicated than they need to be. Just get it trimmed up, get the power set, and just do only what's necessary, nothing more, and let the airplane just cut through the shear, and makes for a much smoother approach and landing. So you can see that huge wind correction angle I have in there, and I'm going to kick out of the crab and the flare, drop that upwind wing, and then land the upwind wheel first, then downwind, then nose. Power to idle right here. I'm going to kick out, land the upwind wheel. Here come the birds. Downwind wheel, boom, there's the bird strike, and then the nose. This runway is also downhill, so I am using reverse thrust here. Remember, when we have a lot of crosswind or no wind on landing, our ground speed is particularly high. So when you have a fairly short runway with a high ground speed downhill, that's a good instance to go ahead and use reverse thrust in the PC-12. So we've got to be out of reverse by 40 knots. That way we don't kick FOD around and ingest it into the engine. So here I'm back in idle, and I'm just going to make a 180 because all the taxiway stubs are closed. So except for one midfield, I'm just going to taxi up to that stub midfield, make the left turn, cross over the closed runway, and then taxi into the ramp. Luckily, the bird strike did absolutely no damage at all whatsoever. I felt bad about hitting the bird, RIP little guy. But the prop was perfectly fine. I couldn't even tell which blade hit the bird. So there was absolutely zero damage to the airplane. You do want to let the tower know, that way they can have the airport ops guys come out and remove the carcass from the runway if it's on the runway. That way the next guy doesn't hit the bird or ingest it into their engine. And depending on the airport, in some cases the airport ops guys will actually send a sample of the feathers off to the FAA. so that the FAA can identify the type of bird, which helps with their data tracking and their wildlife mitigation plans and programs and all that stuff. So, and there's a little report that you fill out on the pilot side as well. Anyway, so I'm just going to make the left turn off the runway here and get the airplane cleaned up, taxi in. You can see all the construction going on, and the birds are still sticking around. Pretty common that time of year in the Midwest. And the PC-12 does very well in crosswind. It's a very stable platform. The key is, like I said, just don't do too much. You don't want to add PIO to the wind shear, so just get it stabilized and keep your crab in till the flare, kick it out, and then just, you know, straighten the nose with the rudder, drop that upwind wing to track the center line, and flare like normal, power out. In a very light airplane, you might want to leave a little power in on a day like this, but it's not necessary in the PC-12. You can see a little more construction going on there on the ramp with all those barricades. There's my ground marshal off to the left. Plenty of time for the engine to cool down on this taxi, and we always want to give it 2 minutes from the selection of ground idle to shut down, just to let the hot section of the engine cool down so we don't shock cool it. Turning off the oxygen, the EPS, taxi light. I like to get everything shut down. There's my noise canceling on my headset. That way, as soon as I pull into my parking spot, I'll set the parking brake and just shut the engine down, and then I can jump right out and let the passengers out. I don't have passengers on this particular leg, but I'm just in the habit of doing it. There goes my rental car. Stop right there. Set the parking brake condition lever to feather cutoff, and I'll note my fuel burn. And do some paperwork, get the airplane all buttoned up, and head out. So that's what a crosswind landing looks like in the PC-12. All right, guys, thanks for coming along, and I'll see you on the next video.